Political impact of the Vietnam War. So we are going to look at the impact, the domestic impact of the Vietnam War. How did the Vietnam War affect and change America? We're going to start with the political impact, move to economic, and then go all the way to social impact of the Vietnam War. Johnson announces March 1st, 1968, I shall not seek and I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president. Politically, Vietnam was a disaster for Johnson. Johnson won his first term shortly after he took over for Kennedy. After his assassination, won his first term, and had great plans for his presidency. Wanted to focus on domestic issues, but tried to tackle too much. Tried to cover all of that was necessary within. Tried to do domestic programs with his Great Society, which was a series of welfare programs set to bring about affordable housing. Medicare and Medicaid were part of these ideas of Medicare for people that were disenfranchised, orphans, widowed, single parents, and just help with this idea of the handicap to help bring about more equality for handicapped people, but also to just help with overall society. And his Great Society was a series of these laws that were going to cost quite a bit of money, and that is one of the things that seems to die within because of the Vietnam War. Nixon and the silent majority. One of the things we know that the Vietnam War divided America, divided its soldiers along lines of race, divided its soldiers along lines of whether they supported the war or didn't support the war. It also divided people at home. People were already divided by race, and this seemed to divide people by class and depending on what they believed about the war. Nixon felt that there was a silent majority that believed that the United States should win the war in Vietnam and would support him. And after his speech, he had a 68% approval rating. So it seemed to be there, but it quickly evaporated with the bombing of Cambodia, and which, after he bombed Cambodia, 60% of America said the United States, or questions what the United States is doing in Vietnam. There were people that supported Nixon, politicians that were on the more conservative side. Ronald Reagan believed that the youth movement and the protests were sex, drugs, and treason. And many of the conservative people in the Republican Party and just conservatives in the United States and older people believed that this was more of what agreed with Ronald Reagan. The Cooper Church Amendment shows that Congress was beginning to sour on the idea of the Vietnam War, and they basically revoke the president's powers under the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution and say that the president needs to go through them as far as attacking Cambodia, expanding the war, that they need to keep the war within South Vietnam, stop the bombing unless they have approval of Congress. This didn't have a lot of teeth to it, however, and Nixon continued to fight his war. One of the things that you can say, Nixon resigned on August 8th, 1974, the first president to resign. And this might have a lot to do with his handling of the Vietnam War, with the Pentagon Papers being leaked. His attempt to try to discover who leaked them led to his paranoia that eventually led to the Watergate scandal and eventually led to his resignation. So Vietnam was part of the downfall of Nixon. The War Powers Act, 1973, Congress passed this act, basically stating that the president may only use his power of commander-in-chief if Congress declares war or in imminent danger, but must go to Congress within days of that to get approval. Otherwise, they must remove U.S. armed forces. So basically stating that, or limiting the president's power to put the U.S. armed forces in different places around the world without congressional approval. And that was a direct attack upon the president's role in Vietnam based on Johnson and Nixon. They wanted to limit the power the president had. Domestic impact, economic. The war was expensive and caused deficits in the federal budget and balance of payments. Johnson's dream of Great Society between 1965 and 1973 died he was only able to do some of it. Many of his Great Society programs had to go to the wayside because for some reason he felt like he could do whatever he wanted foreign policy-wise and domestic, but the foreign policy and his war in Vietnam of $120 billion limited his ability to make an impact on his society. Domestic impact in Vietnam, there's some divisive issues. The anti-war movement began small. It began in colleges, began with intellectuals, and did not seem to go national until later. When Rolling Thunder brought out, which was the bombing in Vietnam, you began to see the movement grow. On first protest in D.C. on April 17, 1965, 25,000 people picketed the White House in response to the bombing of North Vietnam. Who were the activists? Well, realists like Hans Morgenthau and George Kennan, who was the author of the containment policy, even Robert Kennedy, who was the brother of John F. Kennedy, all began to speak out against it, but more of speaking out against whether Vietnam was worth being part of the containment policy. Morgenthau and Kennan said the United States has no strategic need to be in Vietnam. They have no holdings there. They have no reason to contain communism within Vietnam, and began to see that and did not believe in the domino theory, and so believed that the United States could extricate itself from Vietnam and not lose the Cold War. To radicals like the Students for Democratic Society and others that even used terrorist acts to speak out against the Vietnam War, but there were radical groups that staged protests against the U.S. government. The movement peaked in early 1968 after the Tet Offensive, and that brought about even stronger and more prominent movement. And you began to see a lot more protests. And this just showed the division which was in America with Nixon's silent majority of people who felt like these protests were treasonous to others who felt like these protests were exercising their American rights and speaking out against a government that they no longer trusted. Media during the war is a really interesting thing. I wanted you to take a look at some pictures here. This is a picture during the Tet Offensive that shows the wounded American soldier being pulled out by his friends. The Tet Offensive, the filming of the Tet Offensive, and even Walter Cronkite's response to the Tet Offensive, which was to be shocked that America could say that they were so close to the war and then be attacked with such surprising force and be taken for surprise. The Tet Offensive was announced as soon as it happened, and that brought about protests right the next day while it was still being fought. And you see from the American press that the Tet Offensive would not have been as big a deal if the media was not there, if television wasn't there, and the immediacy of knowing about what happened with the Tet Offensive was what made the American public react so strongly against it. Had it been something where it was delayed for a day or 2 days, I think the news would have focused more on the fact that it was a huge defeat for the Viet Cong and the communists rather than looking at it as a defeat for the United States. Here is another photo that's often been misunderstood, was put in the media. This is a general from the South Vietnamese Army who is about to and executes this man here. It seems oppressive. It seems like the U.S. is supporting a corrupt regime. However, the man on your right was accused of being a part of a Viet Cong hit squad that basically killed the family of this general right here. So this man here is considered part of a Viet Cong assassination squad, which was pretty prominent and he just executed this general's entire family. And so you can see why he wants revenge here and why he might execute him right here in the street, based on the fact of this brutal civil war, and that the United States was embroiled in this. But oftentimes this photo is meant to look at how corrupt South Vietnam is, rather than looking at this man's role that might have definitely antagonized this general and even brought about this retribution. So what you see here is a demonstration against the Democratic National Convention, and you can see the brutality of the police just pushing back the protests, and just how divided people were as they're trying to hold the convention to elect the next thing. There is thousands in the street protesting, and you can see within this picture that there's a lot of different things going on here. So in March 1970, U.S. in Cambodia. April 21st, Nixon had his nationally televised speech, and this led to immediate protests. Once Nixon announced that ARVN and U.S. troops were invading and attacking the Ho Chi Minh Trail within Cambodia and Laos, and basically expanding the war, the anti-protest kind of hit a new high, and broke out and continued at colleges. Over 221 colleges throughout the United States. 4 million college and high school students staged a walkout called a moratorium, in which they hit the streets, and did peaceful marches against Nixon and his policies. University presidents and retired military officers, who would often be considered maybe more conservative in this, wrote letters to Nixon urging him to remove U.S. troops now, basically showing again the division within the United States that Vietnam was causing. And a lot of that was brought on by just the news and the media, which was very prompt in showing these different things. Then you have Congress was swamped by anti-war telegrams and joined the nation in denouncing the invasion of Cambodia. And on May 5th, Nixon pledged that U.S. troops would go no more than 20 miles in Cambodia and would withdraw from Cambodia by June 6th. But again, people didn't necessarily believe him. The trust for Nixon, the trust for the American government had evaporated because of the lies, the things that were brought on, and also because of the Pentagon Papers and the release of the Pentagon Papers. And here you see a student lying dead during the Kent State shooting, in which the National Guard opened up and killed 2 people that weren't even protesting of the 4 that died. There was another protest that followed at Jackson State in Mississippi that also shows just the crackdown that the government did upon these protests, and limited people's rights of free speech, and continued to be divisive within America, bringing more and more people to stand against the government. Then you have the Selective Service System, which was a draft. One of the problems with this draft, and why it was a lottery, and so certain numbers would be drawn, and anybody in those numbers would then have to go to Vietnam. But what is interesting here is that there were exemptions. This is you hadn't seen this since the Civil War, where people could buy somebody to replace them in the draft. In this case, exemptions for college students, teachers, and medical notes from doctors were brought about so that if you went in to become a teacher, if you were in college and were accepted and moved straight to grad school, if you couldn't, because doctors, which caused some corruption of paying off doctors to right reasons, senators' sons and others were exempted even without some of these reasons, whereas other people were not. The draft gave young people a direct route to protest the war, a way where they could burn their draft cards, they could go to Canada, they could protest, and basically apply for conscientious objector status, which believes that you do not believe in conflict. 2 Catholic priests stormed the draft office in an attempt to burn files in Michigan. And by 1969, 50% of the men in California refused to show up for the draft. Again, left people to believe that, well, the draft was another divisive element within the American participation in Vietnam that led to a lot of people being upset about the way it was done. And it also brought or continued the race issue because there were more Mexican Americans in the war than there are a higher population in the Army and being drafted than in the society. Same with African Americans. They were a much larger majority of the Army than they were of society. And poor, and the American poor were much more represented than people of rich families who were able to work their way to exemption. So that is the domestic effects of the Vietnam War, and we will wrap this up tomorrow and Monday.